There is nothing anywhere on the face of the earth remotely similar to an atomic bomb. I am, become, death, said the nuclear physicist Robert Oppenheimer as he watched the first A-bomb detonate. I am the destroyer of the world. New York City, vibrant, busy. Seen here from a helicopter with the assistance of night vision goggles, the sort used by the military, and quite possibly by terrorists. Intelligence experts fear for cities like New York. Fear that someday, sooner than later, a nuclear device will fall into the wrong hands, and a city like this will be held hostage. To prevent that from happening, layers of security forces surround nuclear weapons. A positive identification zone surrounds the United States. And a mobile covert operations unit called NEST, the Nuclear Emergency Search Team, stands ready to find and disarm a device, even in downtown Manhattan. But that's not enough. Experts agree that the best defense against nuclear terrorism is to keep nuclear weapons secured, which makes formerly classified congressional documents all the more startling. Secret letters, many seen here for the first time, paint a picture not just of order and control, but of vast nuclear proliferation, of warheads built into everything, of hundreds of accidents, and most of all, of 12 nuclear bombs that are lost and have never been found. Altogether, these documents depict an unusual but true story of nuclear bombs far out of military control, in some circumstances within almost anyone's reach, terrorists included.
In the 50s, we figured if it was nuclear, it was great. So we built everything you could imagine with a nuclear weapon, not just nuclear bombs. We built the Genie air-to-air missile. And this was a nuclear warhead that you fired out into a bomber formation. And when it went off, it would surely take out anything within 5 miles, including you. We had the atomic cannon, where you put a nuclear shell in this cannon and fired it, and it went 15 to 20 miles and exploded within visual sight. And everyone puts their goggles on and boom! We had nuclear torpedoes. Everything we figured had to have a nuclear warhead, and the yield was so large that the return was probably good.
Although there was never apparently any detailed analysis of this, nuclear weapons came to be seen as providing more bang for the buck. That is, that you could kill more people with one weapon that cost, X millions of dollars than you could with a whole phalanx of troops and all of their gear. And therefore, this seemed to be a wonder weapon. We didn't have to deploy then huge armies in Europe. We could simply deploy a relatively smaller number of nuclear weapons and get the same job done.
The trade-offs in designing a weapons carrier are very straining. First of all, if you push it too far into the aerodynamic envelope, maybe a tail will come off. If you get a yaw with engines out on one side, the wings fall off and it tears itself to bits. On the other hand, you want the thing to go as fast as possible. You want it to get to enemy territory as quick as possible with the largest load. So you're willing, in the military environment, to push that a little further. You wouldn't do it in the civilian environment. You want a nice, safe, stable ride. But in the military, you want to get it out there and get it on target. And so if that means that you grasp for the last ounce of performance, you just do.
Weapons transport accidents, I mean, I guess you can divide them into a couple of categories. One would be the transportation of a device or part of a device from a production facility to a deployment facility, or vice versa. Again, these weapons need a lot of attention. And then you would have accidents where planes were actually on operational, or weapons were on operational alert and were accidentally jettisoned from aircraft, for example, or were involved in crashes and fell out of planes or fell with planes.
Bottom line was, we dropped a lot of bombs out of airplanes we shouldn't have dropped. They fell out of machines, they fell out of bomb bays, they went off racks, they were pushed out of cargo planes. We did drop an awful lot of nuclear weapons into various spots around the world, and we still can't find some of them.
America left its first nuclear bomb in Puget Sound. An Air Force B-36 intercontinental bomber lost power in 3 of its engines. The bomber immediately began to lose altitude, and at 8,000 feet, the captain ordered the crew to eject its nuclear bomb. The bomb dropped away and detonated at 3,850 feet, resulting in a bright flash, a shock wave, and a sharp concussion. The aircraft flew further, and the crew bailed out over Vancouver Island, where the bomber then crashed. The classified nuclear components were never found.
Nobody had ever dropped a nuclear weapon out of an airplane other than the tests at Bikini Atoll and some others, but not when you didn't mean to. And here goes this bomb. They all turn around and watch it go out. There's an utter fascination with, is this going to explode? Is this going, and we didn't arm it. It shouldn't been supposed to, but it goes down to this huge flash where the TNT was going off. You can imagine the thoughts. Is this the beginning? Is that really a nuclear explosion? If they hadn't seen one, what are they going to know? Does it go off later? When it hits 2,000 feet where there's a hydrostatic charge or a barometric charge, the trigger that puts it off? You can imagine, first guys that ever had it, and then they're coping with an emergency while they're doing this. Not only are they in real trouble where the airplane's about to break up, but they're all watching this weapon go out. It must have been a horrendous experience for an experienced, combat-savvy combat crew.
Nonetheless, it seems unusual that a flight crew would choose to eject a nuclear bomb at all. This practice, however, was actually accepted operating procedure dating back to World War II.
In World War II, there were a couple reasons for jettisoning the load. First of all, you were probably limping home from enemy territory shot up. You had to get rid of that several thousand pounds of bombs. So you salvoed it, was the word, out of the machine. Secondly, you don't want to be making a crash landing with a bomb load in there, because it skid down the runway and then flames and then maybe an ignited fuel tank, and it will set off TNT. It will explode. And in nuclear weapons, part of the trigger is TNT. So the mentality is, let's get rid of the dangerous stuff so that we survive. And you can salvo it unarmed, so it just goes out of the weapons bay and sticks into the ground like a dart. But the whole thing is, let's get the airplane lighter. We're in trouble. We got engines out. We can't be carrying this load around that we can get rid of and possibly make it back to base.
And so they ejected the bomb. But just 8 months later, it happened again. This time, a B-50 nuclear bomber lost power in 2 of its engines, and to prevent a crash, ejected its bomb into the St. Lawrence River near Quebec. The bomb's high explosives detonated, and the classified components were also never found. 2 bombs in 1 year. 2 more bombs are lost in North Africa. 4 B-47 bombers departed from MacDill Air Force Base en route to a classified destination, now known to have been Ben Guerir Air Base in Morocco. One of the bombers, codenamed Inkspot 59, carried 2 nuclear capsules. All 4 planes proceeded across the Atlantic to the scheduled refueling off the coast of Algeria. Weather was bad, however, and as Inkspot 59 descended to meet the tanker, it entered a layer of solid clouds. The plane radioed a request for vectors to the tanker. but the B-47 was never seen again. A land and water search began immediately and centered over the Sahara Desert 90 miles southwest of Oran, Algeria. But no trace of the bomber, its crew, or either of the nuclear capsules was ever found. A sophisticated nuclear bomber and 2 capsules of pure plutonium simply disappeared.
The B-47 was a groundbreaking airplane, first of all. Every airliner you see looks like a B-47. Pods for engines, swept wing, very sleek, tubular fuselage, slim tail. It was a groundbreaking airplane. As a result, it was more like a fighter than it was a bomber. It was very fast. It took a pretty good stick to fly it, a pretty good pilot, because it had a tandem landing gear, and you couldn't set it down with the rear one first. It would start to bounce. You couldn't set it down with the first one because it would skip off the ground. So you had to make a perfect, what we call today a 3-point landing, in that case 2 points, but a perfect 2-point landing to get it on. It took a lot of feel, a lot of savvy in the cockpit. So here you were on the edge of it, flying a B-47. And then you had to consider going to the Soviet Union and dropping a bomb in this thing. Now, you either were a pretty confident B-47 pilot and liked living on the edge, or you were horrified and you wanted to transfer out of that thing. There weren't any in-betweens in a B-47.
Were it not for its cargo, the mystery of the B-47 would be nothing more than a curiosity. But it carried 2 plutonium capsules. And on this matter, there are no in-betweens either. Plutonium is the one ingredient you must have to have a nuclear bomb.
Basically, if you imagine this large orange, this is about the size of the amount of plutonium that destroyed Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. And what this represents basically is a sphere of plutonium. And this was also the same kind of configuration that was used at the Trinity device that was detonated in July 1945. And around this sphere, you have layers of high explosives leads, TNT essentially in the early years, configured in such a way as to compress this into something maybe the size of a tennis ball, which I should have brought for better comparison. And what would happen is that when you squeeze it, which I won't do here, with the lenses with the high explosives, it becomes supercritical, and that's when it ignites. The hardest thing to acquire to actually have a usable nuclear weapon would be the fissile material, either the uranium or the plutonium, assuming that you didn't steal it or acquire it through some other means of subterfuge. That would be the most difficult thing. I mean, you can get the electrical components, you can get the computer capability, you can build the casing, you can acquire the high explosives, but there are massive industrial capacities necessary to produce this material. I mean, remember that the Manhattan Project in 1996 dollars cost us $20 billion. Over $13 billion of that was spent producing uranium for the bomb, for the little boy bomb over Hiroshima, and another $4 or $5 billion was spent on plutonium production.
All too soon, 2 more bombs went down. A C-124 cargo plane ferrying 3 Mark V nuclear bombs from Dover, Delaware to the Azores lost power in 2 engines, and it began to lose altitude. To save the plane, 1 bomb was ejected at 4,500 feet. The second went out at 2,500 feet, where the plane stabilized. Both bombs hit the water, but neither detonated. It is unclear how deep it was in the impact area, but recovery efforts by the Eastern Sea Frontier Command were unsuccessful.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I would love to get in the minds of the pilots and think, well, let's see, we can land and potentially have an accident, or we can check these weapons off the coast of New Jersey. And, I mean, obviously they must have gotten clearance from that. There were obviously procedures developed to do that. Sure, those weapons are still sitting out there. They're not obviously functioning weapons. I don't think they pose any danger of going off, but it is radioactive material. It's sitting out there underneath or on the ocean floor.
Once you get to an emergency in a large airplane, let's say versus a single-seat fighter, there are multiple more decisions to make. If an engine quits in an F-86 or an F-102 and you can't restart it, decisions are made. I'm either going to dead stick this thing in if I've got an airfield, and a good pilot can do that, or I'm going to jump out. End of discussion, end of worry. In a bomber, you're responsible for many more people than yourself. You've got a crew to look after now. Are these guys going to make it if we have to eject? If the engines go out on one side, you have many more parameters to deal with here. Will the airplane go out of control? Will it break up? Can I make it? How far do I push it? Crew, what do you want to do? All forms of problems happen, and the accident rates among aircraft that lose engines, the accident rates and fatalities among multi-engine aircraft are much higher than among single. You didn't think this would be the case. You lose an engine in a single, oh, he's going in. No, he has simple couple decisions to make. That's it. But there are too many decisions to make in a multi-engine airplane, so the accident rate gets higher because he's trying to make those decisions. Do I make it around to the base? Do I keep trying to milk it home? Do we all jump out? It was much tougher in a multi-engine airplane.
But why wasn't there a successful recovery so close to the New Jersey shore? How can bombs be left behind? The information is unavailable.
Again, these incidents are still highly classified even to this day. We don't know all of the details about them. It would be nice for the government to come clean, as it has in other areas of nuclear weapons, nuclear radiation experiments, for example, and say, yeah, we had some mistakes at the time. But I don't know exactly what was going through the government's mind. All we have to go on are the few memos that we've been able to obtain that have been declassified that suggest that they felt they did everything they could and decided in the interests of cost effectiveness, apparently, that it just wasn't worth the further effort to try. It was just a nuclear weapon, after all. They could always get more of them from the Atomic Energy Commission. A little remarkable. I mean, you would go to greater lengths if you dropped something down the sewer in your or lost something in your garden. I think you would definitely try to locate it.
This is the Low Country along coastal Georgia. Tidal marshes laced by creeks that weave in and around some of the most beautiful land in America. Could these marshes be hiding a nuclear bomb? The documents say they are. Another bomb, the seventh, and by far the most dangerous of them all. On February 5th, 1958, a B-47 bomber carrying a nuclear bomb departed Homestead Air Force Base in Florida for a simulated combat mission. At 3:30 in the morning, an F-86 fighter slammed into its wing and damaged the fuselage. The bomber quickly diverted to Hunter Air Base in Savannah, Georgia for an emergency landing and made 3 unsuccessful attempts. Rather than expose the airbase and surrounding communities to the force of an explosion, the crew decided to eject the bomb. It was dropped into the mouth of the Savannah River from an altitude of 7,200 feet. Navy divers combed the area for 6 weeks, but the bomb was never found.
The midair between the F-86L and the B-47 was a classic early technology incident. First of all, the F-86s were not supposed to be tracking this airplane for practice, but that's what they were doing. The B-47 crew was not told that this was going to happen. The guys in the F-86s, these F-86Ls, they were called the ugliest saber because they had this big blunt nose and then an intake underneath it. And that blunt nose was an early radar. Well, the early radars were so poor that they gave very little information on the return. Other than that's where the airplane might be, you probably better go look at it. And so you're inside the airplane all the time. You're not looking outside. You're inside here looking and trying to interpret what's on the radar. The guys even made the comment that the radar turns weren't too good, and we better do a visual ID to see what this thing is we're tracking and make sure it's the... And they were told it was a cell of B-47s. The B-47s weren't told. So you've got guys in the fighters who are locked in. You've got guys in the bombers who don't know they're being tracked. So immediately you have a recipe for disaster. And that's exactly what happened. One of the F-86s came in and impacted the outboard right engine of the B-47. And there's marks all over the airplane, all the way back to the tail of debris hitting this thing. The B-47 guys got it back. I mean, you're talking about a good crew here. They got it back to Georgia and landed it. The F-86 guy punched out, ended up in a swamp, got recovered, but they all lived, which was really quite a phenomenal thing.
But the story doesn't end there. In the past, letters between the Atomic Energy Commission and Congress clearly state whether or not a given nuclear bomb contained a nuclear capsule. The distinction is important. If it has the capsule, the bomb is armed and the stage is set for a nuclear detonation. If it doesn't, there may be a devastating explosion, but there's no possibility of it being nuclear. In the case of Savannah, 3 letters indicate that the bomb did have its capsule, while a 4th states that it did not. A summary document written 6 years later, though, seems to break the tie. It was a complete weapon. The letter says, a 7,500-pound Mark 15 nuclear bomb in the 1 to 2 megaton yield range, exactly how alert missions were flown in the 50s, with the removable plutonium capsule as the principal failsafe.
Practice missions in the 50s, you got to realize, are not exactly like we consider a practice mission today. You carried live weapons a lot. The old term was hot guns, which kind of takes on almost a blazing saddles kind of connotation, but it really wasn't. The idea was you wanted to fly as close to being armed as possible so that you had a realistic feel. The weapons loaders knew how to put the bomb in there. Everything around it was as realistic as possible.
When you wanted to detonate the bomb, you took the fissile material and inserted it into the bomb casing, sealed everything back up, and then it was ready to go once the appropriate electrical connections were made. Bombardier had to go back into the depressurized part of the plane and manually take all this stuff apart and put it in there. I mean, I can't imagine what would be going through their minds, but very complicated thing to do. It did provide some measure of safety in the 1950s because, for example, if a plane was going to crash or had some problem, you could take the fissile material out of the weapon and separate it. In fact, they had special canisters with parachutes and everything for it, because these things were worth more than their weight in gold in the early years. There weren't very many of them.
But in the confusion and shock of a midair, did anyone have the presence of mind to crawl back and remove the capsule? Likely not, which is why a live bomb sits in Savannah, and where it sits remains classified.
I mean, these were, particularly the ones with operational weapons, that were flying around in alert. I mean, these were very, very secretive operations, and to admit that there had been an accident would be a serious problem. To admit there had been a serious accident, I mean, again, this is a government that didn't reveal anything about nuclear weapons for many, many years, except for the fact that they existed. I mean, the government still has the policy of neither confirm nor deny, whereby we will never say whether nuclear weapons are present or absent in any particular location. That's unfortunate because it's impeding not only our understanding of what happened during the Cold War and putting together a full record, but also whatever residual risks might remain, whether they're environmental or whether they're of a security standpoint.
There's a footnote to this incident. The Department of Defense was sufficiently worried about the Savannah bomb to warn Congress that it might be found. Quote, that there exists the possibility of accidental discovery, unquote. Shrimpers in the area would agree with that. Rumors abound that their nets have snagged the bomb time and again. And still, no one has come back to search these shallow waters. The 8th bomb was lost over land. During an alert mission, a B-52 bomber with 2 20-megaton thermonuclear H-bombs met its refueling tanker off the coast of North Carolina. After taking on fuel, a leak began in the right-wing root, and the aircraft became unstable. The pilot diverted for an emergency landing at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, North Carolina, but the right wing caught fire, failed, and the bomber exploded in the sky. Both H-bombs were tossed free, and the fiery B-52 crashed into open farmland. One bomb was recovered, but the second bomb's thermonuclear secondary was never found. 'Cause 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 'cause
B-52 had a fuel leak. And a fuel leak in a B-52 is pretty serious because it carries hundreds of thousands of gallons of gas. And all of a sudden, one side of the airplane was running out of gas. Matter of fact, it emptied it out in about a minute and a half. And 100,000 gallons or more came out. And so they had to start transferring fuel to balance the airplane out. And it was leaking fuel so fast it was not able to compensate. And they were trying to make it down to Seymour Johnson to land. And finally the airplane was going out of control. And it did a barrel roll kind of maneuver and started to break up. And everybody had to get out. And so they did. And of course it went down with a nuclear weapon.
This is the Goldsboro crash site. The burning B-52 came across this road and slammed into this field. Recovery crews were on the scene quickly, and the first bomb was found right away. The second bomb, though, broke apart as it hit, and both the nuclear primary and the secondary smashed through the weapon's casing and burrowed into the ground. Digging began immediately, but muddy water kept flooding the crater. The thermonuclear secondary was considered irretrievably lost.
When an airplane goes down with a nuclear weapon aboard, you're in a different kind of Air Force now. These are guys who don't fly airplanes. They might have in the past as accident investigators, but quite often they aren't. And you have a nuclear disarmament team that has to find the bomb and make sure all the components are disassembled and it's not a radiation hazard and all kinds of other things. Or will it explode? Is there a trigger waiting to go off? It's now completely out of the hands of the flying frontline Air Force. It is now in the hands of experts who are quite good at what they do and are quite properly concerned, as is the Atomic Energy Commission. They're in the middle of it. They want to know what's happened, and they're in charge of all U.S. nuclear material in the end. So what do? We've got to find this bomb.
Particularly this bomb, a hydrogen bomb. There are two components in a hydrogen bomb: a primary, which is an atomic bomb, and a secondary, which is the fusion bomb. Scientists call the secondary the evil part of the weapon, the H in H-bomb.
With a hydrogen bomb, you've got the primary, the atomic bomb is the starter device, the trigger, if you will, and then the fusion material is the secondary. So when you hear about these weapons falling out of planes, if they're hydrogen bombs, and you hear about the capsule perhaps not being in the weapon, that would be the primary stage, the pit of the weapon. If you hear about the secondary being lost, that would be the fusion material, the lithium deuteride and the tritium. And sometimes it also contains what's called a spark plug, which is a kind of shaft of plutonium that's used to help ignite the whole fusion reaction.
Are there more lost bombs? Yes, but it's hard to know how many. Almost anything having to do with nuclear weapons is classified, including the exact location of a bomb, lost or not. Continued classification of these data seems unnecessary.
Nuclear weapons data are essentially born classified, and that terminology comes from the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which was later amended in 1954. This information was considered so sensitive that any mention of it, even if back in the 1950s, if you and I were having a conversation, if we were just talking about something, that would be classified information, even if we didn't have access to it. I think a lot of these incidents, as with a lot of the information that remains classified today, remains classified because of its embarrassment value, which is not a legitimate means for classification. It's never been, but that doesn't mean that the government can't withhold it. And I think we'll find out as more of this information comes to light, as people like yourself and myself, we start doing more digging. I think we'll see that a lot of cases it was simply, well, it'd be better if this didn't get out.
Nonetheless, 4 more lost bombs are chronicled in the declassified documents. 70 miles from Japan, an A-4 Skyhawk rolled off the deck of the USS Ticonderoga with an armed nuclear bomb. Neither the plane nor the bomb were ever recovered. In 1968, a B-52 crashed on the ice cap near Thule Air Force Base, Greenland. The high explosives on all 4 bombs detonated, and one of the 4 nuclear secondaries burned through the ice cap and was never recovered. Near Whidbey Island, Washington, a Navy P-5M carrying a nuclear anti-submarine depth charge was forced to ditch after an engine caught fire. As the plane settled in the water, the weapon was ejected It sank and was never recovered. In 1958, a Navy FJ-4B aircraft inadvertently released a classified operational suitability test weapon off Kanuma Point Lighthouse on the island of Hawaii, and it was never recovered. 4 more unusual accidents, 4 more lost bombs. In each case, the circumstances are understandable, but still, the bombs were never recovered. Perhaps it's just a matter of luck to find a bomb, but perhaps not. At least not when the bomb makes international headlines. On January 17, 1966, following an alert mission over the Baltic, a B-52 bomber with 4 nuclear bombs collided mid-air with a KC-135 tanker. Both airplanes exploded, and all 4 nuclear bombs broke free and fell 30,000 feet. The high explosives of 2 bombs detonated on impact, spreading radioactive material over a large area. The 3rd bomb did not detonate. The 4th was not immediately found.
Aerial refueling of any form is probably right up there with landing on a carrier. The 2 most difficult things you can do with a machine on the face of the earth, and one is to get a machine on a boat, the other is to fly a machine within a few feet of the other one, not hitting. Now that looks real easy. The films are these airplanes sailing along. You don't see the cockpits. In the cockpit of a B-52, the guy is moving the wheel like this. It moves about this fast, all the time. It's just a constant, and the sweat's just pouring down his face. He'll usually pop his mask off because the sweat's just getting down in there, and he's doing this with the throttles. And so he's got one hand on this huge, hundreds of thousands of pounds of metal, and he's got 8 throttles he's working, and he's doing this all the time. And the airplane looks completely still. It is very difficult. So here, this B-52 running into a tanker is not an unusual thing. It is a part of the job to try not to do that, but their mid-airs are an accepted fact of life in mid-air refueling.
But what isn't a fact of life for ordinary people is a lost nuclear bomb. And although it was several days before the Air Force finally confirmed it, Europeans began protesting the bomb almost immediately. The United States had no choice but to find it.
The fact that this accident occurred in a very public way, it couldn't be hidden. Although the government did deny for 3 days that nuclear weapons were involved, and of course had to eat crow once they admitted that they were involved. And in fact, that accident is interesting. When they recovered the final of the B-28 weapons, which, depending on which source you talk about, was either a 4 megaton weapon or a 20-plus megaton weapon, they displayed it to show that they had in fact recovered this thing using the submersible Alvin and some other means, and it was the first time that an H-bomb had been publicly displayed.
Compared to the farmland of North Carolina or the Georgia Lowcountry, Palomares was a nightmare, and finding the lost bomb took months. Searchers had to deal with rough terrain, old mine shafts, and a 12,000-foot underwater trench just offshore, with Soviets rushing to get there first. It took a tent city of men, a Navy flotilla, $50 million, and a deep submersible operated by John Lindbergh to find it, 2,250 feet down, balanced precariously on the edge of the trench. But find it they did. Coming to terms with lost bombs is hard. So much more needs to be known. The Department of Defense, for instance, has not acknowledged a single nuclear accident involving an aircraft since 1980, even though an accident occurred every 75 days for the preceding 30 years. What's more, none of the other nuclear nations, Russia included, have ever reported any accidents at all. How many have they lost, and where are they? And if you thought only nuclear nations carried nuclear bombs, you'd be wrong. The United States equipped Belgium, Greece, Italy, Germany, Turkey, and even tiny Holland with bombs. And none of these countries have ever released their crash data.
NATO was loaded with nuclear weapons. They flew them with us. The French flew them, the British flew them, It was a very large net of nuclear capability. Everybody had a certain target. And so all of that was, when we say go, everyone launches with a certain kind of weapon. It was a very unified kind of thing. We realized you can't have guys going half-cocked with nuclear weapons. You've got to have them all fairly well under some form of control. And they were.
I would find it hard to believe that the British and the French did not have, of course French not being part of NATO for so long, did not have accidents. And of course we had a lot of weapons in Europe, particularly in Germany, that were for use by the German Air Force and elsewhere. And I would be very surprised if there weren't accidents.
Of course, nuclear bombers weren't the only aircraft to carry nuclear bombs. No less than 20 types of American aircraft were fitted for nuclear weapons. The A-7 Corsair, for instance, was launched from an aircraft carrier with a nuclear bomb under its wing. To help it survive its own attack, it would lob the bomb, a technique which gave it time to get away from the blast.
It wasn't unusual to have dozens of airplanes in the air or capable of being in the air that could carry nuclear weapons in any one day. Kind of crazy when you think about it. And they're flying over your hometown. They're flying over your house. I mean, they're all over the place. But that was the environment we lived in. It was either be prepared to go to war and be ready to use them, or be caught in an attack.
According to the United States Department of Energy, America built almost 70,000 nuclear warheads and bombs in 65 different configurations. Some were as small as a backpack. Others weighed 43,000 pounds. And 12 are lost. To put that into perspective, consider this. Much of the eastern seaboard of the United States is in the theoretical kill zone of at least one bomb. And that's only for the bombs we know about.
In light of the new, environmental awareness today, plus the fact that the Cold War is over and we can now talk freely about this stuff and say, what the heck is that doing in my backyard? Instead of, well, I'm glad they're up there protecting my freedom. When word starts to trickle out about these things, as I'm sure it will, as more research is done, that people might demand that something be done. I'm sure the Department of Defense will come out and say, well, we looked into all that and everything is fine. But it's a good political issue. Somebody can say, I want to clean this up, and who knows? It could happen. I mean, I think Savannah River is certainly a good case in that it's a relatively well-defined area. The ones off New Jersey, I mean, it's who knows? I mean, that's a little trickier.
If bombs aren't cleaned up, what are the risks? For instance, could there be a nuclear explosion? Scientists without access to classified information think not, although the Savannah bomb is fully armed. But there are other dangers. One is called a radiological explosion. In this scenario, the high explosive component of a nuclear bomb goes off and scatters a cloud of deadly radioactive plutonium. If, for instance, plutonium had been placed and mixed into the World Trade Center bomb, the building would have been contaminated for life. Then there are tides and currents to consider. Could a nuclear bomb wash ashore? And are they booby-trapped? And could that hurt innocent people? In 1995, 4,500 incendiary canisters drifted out of a World War II munitions dump and washed ashore along the coast of Scotland. Several exploded, and one child was badly burned. And, although it remains highly classified, nuclear scientists suggest that nuclear weapons are thoroughly booby-trapped.
If you look over the fairly scant information that's been released, I mean, in some cases, the one in the Savannah River, for example, fell into the muck of the river and essentially disappeared. I mean, these were fairly large devices weighing thousands of pounds. They did contain, in some cases, nuclear material, which you would think would be detectable by some means. And yet, from the available evidence, it looks like that the Air Force, which again was operating the planes out of which these bombs fell, determined after doing some rigorous searching in some cases that it was just too expensive to go and retrieve the weapon. And you can see calculations, for example, in the Savannah crash and also the one in North Carolina, that if we did X, it would cost $500,000 And the assumption then is that it would cost much less to actually replace the weapon. And then you see little notations in the official memos saying, the Defense Department has considered this weapon irretrievably lost and has notified the Atomic Energy Commission to replace it. Just like, well, we misplaced this, can you please give us another one? And by the way, let's not tell people about it. I mean, some of these accidents were rather highly publicized, but many more were not.
It was a very tough environment. As a child, I remember the duck and cover drills of jumping under the desk and putting my arms over my head and say, don't look at the flash. What's the kid going to do? He's going to look at the flash. All of us kind of had the idea that we weren't going to live through this, even as children. And my father was an Air Force fighter pilot. I remember those feelings of him being gone, of him having disappeared for weeks, sometimes months at a time, and he couldn't tell us where he was. Well, he was on some form of nuclear alert or nuclear standby. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were as close as we were going to get. Everybody went into the bunkers. All the pilots disappeared. All the families had no one left at home. And we didn't know what was going to happen. That was a constant with Air Force and Navy personnel.
If you go to the Air and Space Museum, you'll see an air-launched cruise missile, which we still deploy on B-52 bombers. The warhead package for that is only about 3 feet long. I mean, it would sit on your tabletop, and that's got an explosive yield of a few hundred kilotons. A kiloton is 1,000 tons of TNT. A megaton is 1,000,000 tons of TNT. Hiroshima was destroyed by a weapon of about a yield of about 12 to 15 kilotons. Nagasaki was about 22. Trinity was about 22. So a megaton, 1,000,000 tons of TNT, it's an enormous amount. I've got a wonderful calculation of it that Kostitsipas, an MIT physicist, did, where if you had 1,000,000 tons of TNT on a train, it would take something like 6 hours to pass in front of you going 60 miles an hour. I mean, it's a huge, huge amount of material.
A Strategic Air Command pilot flew probably some of the most exhausting missions of the Cold War. They would launch these bombers, B-52s, B-47s, to orbit just outside the Soviet Union. You'd put them on tanker support. You'd try to put a couple of extra crews aboard so that you could fly 24 hours plus. You couldn't do that with a single crew. You'd wear them out. That was hard to do because, believe it or not, for a bomber that large, the crew compartments are very small. Most of the airplane's given over to fuel and a few bombs. So here you are, orbiting in the dark over the Baltic, trying to decide, is this real? Are we going to go to war? Am I orbiting out here because there's something going on? They don't tell anybody in the cockpit. There isn't any news channel here where you find out what's going on. For all he knows, there's a nuclear war has started. So you're always in this tension, and you're breathing oxygen. It dries your system out. It pulls all the moisture out of your body. First of all, you can't get enough to drink. You're sitting in a spot so all your blood pools in your lower extremities and your legs begin to go numb. You have heat, you have those things, but now you've got a rubber face mask on. It smells bad. You have a helmet with rubber pieces in it. It never fits right. Good fitting helmets are something of recent origin. In the old days, you get hot spots. So this little bump that doesn't mean anything for an hour or two now takes on like a drill going through your skull. And you push the helmet around, trying to get it to feel, but you push it on one side or you take it off and sit in your pressurized environment, which you can do. But if you're hit by something, immediately the pressurization goes. It's better to have your helmet on. In a combat environment, you never took this stuff off. You left it on. You try to take it off, have coffee, have a meal. It was miserable.
The total amount of money that the U.S. government has spent, that U.S. taxpayers have spent on nuclear weapons, all aspects of them, research, development, deployment, cleanup, command and control systems, defensive measures, secrecy, classification, everything, the whole panoply of nuclear weapons and the infrastructure necessary to support them is $4 trillion, a minimum of $4 trillion.
Pilots in the 50s made up for the lack of technology with skill, raw skill. They were some of the finest pilots that have ever flown. They came out of the World War II era, stick and rudder era, had a good sense of maneuvering an airplane or handling an airplane, and then went into the supersonic and nuclear era with a lot of reserve capability. And even the guys who were new at it were trained by guys who had been there and known how to fly airplanes. So we're talking about real heroes here. Guys who were on the line, family problems because they weren't ever home, divorce rates were high, kids who didn't know their dads. And these guys sacrificed that to defend the nation. And they really believed they were defending the nation, and they were defending the nation. Who knows what would have happened in Eastern Europe or the rest of it had we not had this deterrent. They're the unknown heroes of the Cold War.
Savannah, Goldsboro. What's most remarkable about this story is that everyone seemed to know about these bombs, from the Department of Defense to the Department of Energy, from Congress to the President. And still, they remain lost to this day in rivers and fields, just miles from our beaches. In dealing with the bombs, though, finding fault is hard. Airplanes crash, systems fail. Recovery teams dig and dig until they can dig no more. Ultimately, reasonable people will give up. And yet, there are 12 lost nuclear bombs.